You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to episode 353 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. How did Indigenous people adapt to and survive the onslaught of Indigenous warfare, European diseases, and population loss between the 16th and 18th centuries? How did past generations of Indigenous women ensure that their culture would live on from one generation to the next so that their people would continue to endure? Brooke Bauer, an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and author of the book Becoming Catawba, Indian Women in Nation Building, 1540 to 1840, joins us to investigate these questions and what we might learn from the Catawba. During our investigation of Catawba life and culture, Brooke reveals information about Catawba-speaking peoples and their Piedmont homelands, the emergence of the Catawba Nation, and the crucial roles women performed to create and adapt Catawba culture, and the importance of Catawba women's pottery practices to ensuring the flourishing of Catawba culture and the economic survival of Catawba families and communities in the early American Republic. But first, if you'd like to receive the show notes for each new episode right in your inbox, be sure to sign up for the Ben Franklin's World Gazette, the e-newsletter for this podcast. Signing up is really easy. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. That's benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. And with that, let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. You may remember from episode 158 that she's a citizen of the Catawba Nation with a research expertise in the histories of Southeastern Native American peoples. And she's just published a book on this subject, Becoming Catawba, Catawba Women and Nation Building, 1540 to 1840. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Brooke Bauer.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be back as a guest again.
Well, we were really fascinated with what you had to say about the Catawba people when we talked about the military assistance they provided to the revolutionaries during the American Revolution. So we just knew we had to have you come back when you finished your book, Becoming Catawba. So Brooke's book is out. It's called Becoming Catawba, and it investigates the early Indigenous and colonial history of the Piedmont region and the early American Southeast. Brooke, the Piedmont region is something we're going to talk a lot about today. So could you tell us about this region, where we'll find it on our mental maps of the United States, and what drew you to study the peoples of this region?
Yeah, so the Piedmont region, it's called the foothills because the Piedmont region sits at the very base of the Appalachian Mountains. And I specifically focus on the region in the Carolinas. This area is often called the backcountry as well, but it's a very specific environmental region. And it's situated between the fall line along the Atlantic coastal plains and, like I said, the Blue Ridge Mountains, specifically for Carolina. So what you see in terms of the terrain is gently rolling hills. And the region right before European intrusion is full of almost every natural resource that the native people of this region would need to survive. And I constantly call it a 24-hour grocery store because it does function in that way.
This is a really good lead-in because I think we're curious about what we would see if we were able to tour this region, the Piedmont of the Carolinas, prior to European arrival. Could you tell us a bit more about what we would see and what we would hear and what we could pick up in this 24-hour supermarket?
Yeah. If you can imagine this area, there are open fields of grass, not like the grass that you mow in your front yard, but the tall grasses. These are indigenous grasses like blue stem. And sometimes we often think of them as similar to manna grass, which was used to make brooms at one time. There would have been a variety of trees, oak, hickory, the indigenous pine, which is really difficult to find today, the poplar tree, nut trees, and berry bushes. And in the river, which was a large part of indigenous people's lives in Carolina and elsewhere, it was a place, if you were nearby, you might hear the gentle rippling of the water as it flows across the shoals. So the way that I think of this area before European contact is, in my imagination, I was visiting one of these villages and I would hear the people talking. They're carrying on conversations throughout the day. The women are maybe talking about their children, how they're doing, if they're sick, those kinds of conversations. They may have been talking about relatives who lived in the next village, because intermarriage within these villages would have been common. And children playing near the river, squeals of excitement. And that would have also been true at night, where children were known to throw pieces of river cane into the fires, and it popped, kind of like fireworks do today. And it just sent children into giggles and squeals. Women would have been cooking. They would have been watching the children. Men probably were making blowgun darts. So they would have been fashioning the dart itself, whittling it, and then tying rabbit fur around it to help push it through, guide it through the blowgun. But like I said, you would have heard or seen waterfalls. You would have been able to see the mountains in the distance. If you explored beyond the village, you might have seen a pile of rocks that would have, for the people of that village, been representative of an imaginary boundary to their territory. But I see it as just bustling villages and people living their daily lives under different circumstances and in different ways, but not much different than the way we do today.
What about the people who lived in this region? You mentioned that there were a lot of people who lived in this Piedmont region prior to European arrival. So could you tell us about them? Do they belong to one tribe or one nation, or are we talking about many different tribes and nations of people?
Before European intrusion, it's hard to say specifically which language all the people spoke. But you did have a group who spoke what I call a Catawba language. This is often in other documents referred to as the Eastern Siouan language. But I say Catawba specifically to distinguish it from the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota languages. When Hernando de Soto and his expedition came up through the Carolinas, we know that there were certain villages like Cofetachequi, and then further north there was Jora, or at the time it was Zwala, and there was Chalique, which most scholars suggest that this was the early Cherokee people, but all these villages were really close to one another. And I imagine that the violence of the 1700s hasn't hit these villages as hard. And therefore, regardless of language, there's more intermarriage among all of these villages, even the early Cherokee. Was there violence? Yes. But it wasn't as amplified as it would come to be by the mid-1700s.
It's interesting that there was all this violence pre-European contact. I think when many of us think about Indigenous violence, it's happening with Europeans on the ground. So what caused this pre-European violence? Was this violence about territory, land, hunting grounds, or was it a fight over natural resources?
This was a fight over natural resources. Tribes were experiencing population losses even before European invasion. And so they were taking captives even then, but they're also taking captives for spiritual ritual reasons. So there is that precursor that does exist. Like I said, it's just not to what we typically think of in the 18th century.
Do we know what accounted for this population loss among Indigenous peoples? When we've spoken with other scholars, they note how Europeans may not have been settled on the eastern seaboard in these earlier periods, but Europeans were in the area and they were trading along the coast. So these scholars have said that it was usually European diseases that impacted Indigenous peoples and led to this sort of population loss that you're talking about. Is this what the latest archaeological research or the latest research that you've read still indicates, that Indigenous population loss was overwhelmingly caused by European diseases even before Europeans had settled along the eastern seaboard?
Well, European disease was only one factor of population loss. The others were, of course, warfare. Warfare has always existed on some level, and this will definitely change after 1700, especially among Catawba-speaking people. It's going to result in a significant decrease in the population because not only does death accompany warfare, but captivity accompanies warfare. And because of this captivity, you see native communities in the Piedmont area losing significant numbers of their people, mainly women of childbirthing, reproductive age, and young children. These were the targets of enemies because, especially with children, it was thought that they could assimilate to a new community much easier.
So on the one hand, warfare is causing a lot of population loss, and this loss comes from both death on the battlefield, so to speak, and from the capturing of young women and children. And of course, on the other hand, then you have this practice of capturing the young women and children of your enemy as one way that Indigenous peoples are looking to repopulate their own tribes and nations in the face of this population loss caused by disease and warfare.
Yes. And this was the early 1700s to around 1760. This was very common between the Haudenosaunee people and Catawbas. James Merle, historian who wrote The Indians' New World, he calls this the Iroquois-Catawba War and is really aptly named because it is a war that's consistent between these two people.
The Haudenosaunee live primarily in what we would call today New York and in parts of Canada, and the Catawba, or these people who speak the Catawba language, primarily live in the Carolina Piedmont. That's a really long distance over which to conduct a war, especially when you don't have things like interstate highways or a direct water route.
Yes, the politics in these Carolina Native communities is very complex. We often compare them to the Mississippian people and a Mississippian chiefdom. Well, it's somewhat structured that way, but it is different than what was happening over in, say, for instance, Cahokia. These were much smaller populations, and there was hierarchy or rank where a leader assumed authority over the primary or paramount chiefdom is what it's often referred to, but also authority over outlying tribal communities. By the time that Hernando de Soto comes through the middle part of South Carolina around Columbia, the Cofetachequi chiefdom The people have experienced population decline already from some type of sickness. We don't know exactly what the disease was. But the lady of Kofetacheki, she was the leader of that chiefdom, and she had control or authority over surrounding villages. And the next decade, when Juan Pardo comes through, that chiefly authority has transitioned further north to the chiefdom of Jora and another chiefdom called Wateree. So the leaders within these tribes, the political leaders, have much more geographical authority.
It sounds like warfare created a lot of pressures on indigenous populations during the 16th through the 18th centuries, which seems to have in turn complicated an already complex system of politics that indigenous nations had. And this was all before Europeans like Hernando de Soto arrived to explore and then eventually settle and dispossess indigenous peoples of their lands.
Yeah, so he landed in what we think of as Tampa Bay, and he was in Kofetacheki by 1540. And he would travel further north, passing by smaller native villages. So 1540 is really the first time that these groups have contact with the Spanish. Would happen again in, I think, 1562 when Juan Pardo came through. But during Pardo's travels, he specifically mentions the Isa, which is the original name of the Catawba people, Iswa, which means the river people. And by 1750, settlers have really infiltrated the Piedmont region, but definitely right before the American Revolution. By this time, the Catawba-speaking people have coalesced into a nation, and they're surrounded by settlers.
By the time Europeans arrived, North America was already a very complex place. Indigenous peoples had their own geopolitics that they had to navigate. They had their own fights and battles with neighboring and distant tribes, and they were also facing population loss due to warfare and disease. But they also lived in places where there was an abundance of rich natural resources. So, Brooke, if this is what life was like in the southern Piedmont before Europeans arrived, what was it like after Europeans had arrived to settle on indigenous lands?
Well, Europeans come with set ideas about how society should be structured, what men should do and what women should do and what women should not do. And they failed to recognize the respect and crucial roles that women play within their native communities. They're just not aware of how important women were to their people, to the survival of their communities. That's one way that Europeans come in and try to change things. They want this strict gender binary. Most native communities at this time don't work in that way. Gender is a lot more fluid. A person can choose what gender they identify with. And the other part of that story is that British people are really quick to think that the only way that, especially Catawba people and other Piedmont Indians like the Saponi, the only way that they can become civilized is by taking their children and educating them in the Christian doctrine. Alexander Spotswood, the governor for Virginia, he jumps on this right away and takes hostages from local tribes in Virginia. And after some wars, he takes native children hostage. He works to found the Fort Christiana, which will be a school for Indian children. And at this time, it's specifically Indian boys that he is taking. So education in this Christian way is just one of the Indian policies that starts early on in the 1700s. So the British specifically come into this region and expect to change everything and make it like them. And it just doesn't happen that way.
Having spoken with a number of scholars on this podcast, I think we have some understanding that land is a really significant part of Indigenous ways of life, and that European arrival meant many changes to Indigenous life because there was land dispossession and fights over natural resources. And while it sounds like all of this was going on in the case of the Catawba, it also sounds like, from what you just said, the Catawba were also in a fight for their Indigenous culture, that Europeans were trying to make great changes to their culture and religion. And I wonder if you could tell us more about this.
Yes, and I'm glad that you mentioned land because it's a priority for Europeans. And Catawba territory at this time is immense. It stretches north up to the North Carolina-Virginia state line, west to the Broad River, east to the PD River, and south to where the Congaree River begins. And this is a large amount of territory that, like you mentioned, has immense natural resources that Catawba people can depend on. But it's also territory that's rich and fertile, which European settlers are looking for that kind of land. So as early as 1730, the North Carolina governor, Arthur Dobbs, he writes back to London complaining about how much territory Catawba owns, and they don't do anything with most of it. This is a misperception in use of land, whereas Europeans view land as a commodity. It's a place that you change by deforestation and economic development. Whether that be homes and farms, is still development. Catawba people, Piedmont Indian people, didn't see land in that way. It was their territory, their hunting territory, their village territory, but it was more of a spiritual connection to the land. And the Master of Life had given them this land to take care of, not to destroy. So by 1763, when a Catawba leader, Colonel Ayres, was at the Congress of Augusta, he told the governors of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, he told them, he said, "My land is spoiled in every direction." And what he means is that these settlers have come in and literally destroyed the land. And that's how he viewed it. And their struggle to keep their land would continue all the way up to 1840.
One of the many pieces of knowledge that we can learn from Brooke's book, Becoming Catawba, is that Indigenous peoples in the Piedmont region, the Catawba-speaking peoples that we've been talking about, show great resilience and persistence among these threats and assaults on their land, culture, and people. Brooke, we often talk about resilience and persistence when we talk about Indigenous peoples. Could you tell us what resilience and persistence means for the Catawba, who we've been talking about?
As a Native person, a Native woman, I tire of always having to say that we are resilient. I mean, we've had to be resilient, but it's tiring to constantly have to fight decade after decade, century after century for survival. But in answer to your question, the process of coalescence where smaller populated tribes in the Piedmont area end up joining with the Iswa. They did this because of the Indian slave trade. And because their communities were being hit so hard with their enemies coming in and taking their relatives and bartering or selling them to other indigenous communities or French, British, Spanish. So by 1744, a Carolina trader came in. His name was John Adair, and he was among the Catawbas that year. And he mentioned in his writings that he heard 25 different dialects of Catawba language that was spoken in the village that he was in. And to me, this is just a reference point saying all these people have come together up under Catawba because this is the practice of coalescence. While we often think of it as disruptive for Indigenous communities, it is. But I think we also have to think about it as a strategic exercise by these communities, an exercise for survival. So there are several processes of coalescence that happens during Catawba ancestors' lives. And by the mid-1700s, these different villages have come together under Catawba and now are referred to by the English and other Europeans, even other native nations, as the Catawba Nation. This is just one feature of resiliency, of persistence, because survival is the basic need of a human. That's all they're fighting for, is just to make it from one day to the next. And that's also the case for Catawbas. And women were really significant to the formation of the Catawba Nation because women carry the Catawba identity, because Catawba-speaking people were matrilineal, meaning their ancestry or their identity followed the line of a Catawba woman. And so as all these communities are coming together under one, it's the women who are playing really crucial roles in uniting these communities. Some of them are intermarrying with other communities. They work alongside one another once they have coalesced. They share ideas. They share pottery traditions. I mean, just in one of the villages, Nassau, occupied by Catawbas in the 1750s, archaeologically, there are two distinguishing lines within the village. To the north, you see pottery being made with a certain type of exterior treatment. In the middle, there's little exterior treatment. And to the south, there is a different type of exterior treatment. So this kind of clues me in as a historian, but also as a Catawba potter to say, hey, these are either other people coming in or established lineages that are practicing their own way of building pottery, of marking pottery. The way they mark that pottery is part of their identity. You know, as a potter, I wish I could step back in time and see what was happening and how these women were working with the clay. So that is part of my book in showing how crucial these women were to the formation of the Catawba Nation.
We should spend a few minutes talking about pottery because it's fascinating and it's one of the most fascinating aspects of Brooke's book, Becoming Catawba. But first, let's take a moment to thank our episode sponsor. Women played important and at times unexpected roles in early America, roles that would help advance and shape what would become the United States. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation honors women and the important work they contributed to early American societies with a slate of special programming during Women's History Month. Come to Colonial Williamsburg and hear how the women and men who created the United States discussed and debated the rights of women in Nation Builders Discuss the Rights of Women program. Or visit the art museums of Colonial Williamsburg for programs about women's material culture, or the items that women used, wore, and made. Programs like one about quilts and the women who made them, or the articles of clothing and accessories that made up women's dress and fashion, or about how women created and influenced the development of popular fashions with the shoes they made, purchased, and wore. Join the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation this March and every March for its special Women's History Month programming. To learn more, visit benfranklinsworld.com/CWWomen. That's benfranklinsworld.com/CWWomen. Brooke, I'm curious about women and their role in preserving and ensuring the passing on of Catawba culture, just as they do through their pottery. So would you tell us about the pottery that Catawba women are producing in this early period, how they produce that pottery, and why it seems to be women who are producing that pottery and not men?
Well, with pottery, it's more of a stationary practice. When you're building pottery, regardless of the style, you can't start and then leave it for days when you go out to hunt. So that part right there makes it a lot more difficult for men of this time period to get involved in making pottery. I suspect that some men were involved in making pottery. There's no evidence to support that. They would have been involved in digging the clay. That was really strenuous labor because it meant digging a hole anywhere from 6 to 8 feet. So that's really strenuous work, and sometimes they might help the women carry the clay back to the village, but it was usually the women who did make the pottery. They were the ones who bartered or sold the products of their labor, which included pottery. Pottery is traditional knowledge and skills that has been passed along over the centuries from one generation to the next. And usually it is the women who do it. As I said, they're in the towns or the villages more frequently than the men are, because at this time, the men are either out hunting or going to war. The actual process of making clay, my grandmother used to say that people think that we go down to the river and dig up the pots as they are, that people don't understand all the steps that there are to both processing the clay and then building the pot or the jar or the vase. I have put 72 hours into one piece of pottery. That's not even including the processing part of it, because the clay is processed, and by process, I mean it's cleaned by hand. So at this time, they would have allowed the clay to be like bone dry, and then they would have taken a large wood mallet and pounded it till it becomes this fine, powdery substance, which makes it easier to pick out the trash, like acorn remains, roots, large pieces of sand or quartz. And that can take a whole day.
For those of us who haven't seen Catawba pottery, could you describe this pottery for us and tell us more about why pottery plays such a big role in the culture of the Catawba?
So early on, pottery was used by Catawba-speaking people more for utilitarian purposes. When they built extremely large jars, some of these jars, the men would take them and stretch deer hide over the top of them, and they would serve as a community drum that could be used to alert other towns or just to call the people together. Other pieces were made that had like a conical bottom, meaning it didn't rest flat on the ground. And after they were burned, or as some people say, after they were fired, they would come out of the fire black, gray, brown. Some of it would come out with reddish tones, which meant there was a lot of iron in the clay. Some of the pieces had all of these colors. All these colors were often on one piece. And so because of the conical bottom of these jars, they just rested very gently in hot coals. They were used for cooking in that way. So they didn't hang over a fire like we think of from settler homes, where they had these big iron pots that they hung over the hearth. By 1762, Catawbas had to move their village because of smallpox, and they moved closer to a town called Camden, South Carolina. Well, there was a factory there, a ceramic factory. And I suspect that Catawba women saw the type of goods the owner of this factory was selling and decided to change the forms, not the foundation of making pottery, but just kind of switch up the forms to where these items would be more appealing to the settlers who lived around them and even those who lived along the coast, because women traveled during the summertime all the way to Charleston. And the piece of pottery that was highest in demand by women in Charleston it's called a milk pan. And it has vertical sides. It had a flat bottom. And it wasn't immensely deep, but it was deep enough that the women could pour milk in it, let it set, and wait for the cream to rise. And the cream being butter. And they said that Catawba pots were the best ones for doing that, going through that process. The other piece that was in high demand from Charleston was the okra pot, which Catawbas don't make as frequently today. At the time, in the late 1700s, the women of Charleston were often known to say that nothing is better than a Catawba okra pot. So after 1760, when Catawba women changed the forms of their pottery, they met this market demand, which would increase during the American Revolution because of the lack of trade goods coming from England. And so they found their niche in this market. They bartered, they sold, and one of the interesting things in terms of bartering these pieces of pottery is that, say, for example, a woman is selling a large jar that she has made. She might ask for the person who is buying it to fill it up with corn up to the top, and that would be the payment for the pot. So these women were very astute about what was going on around them. While they may not be entrepreneurs in the sense that we think of entrepreneurship today, they definitely were making their mark in the backcountry market economy.
Yeah, and I think that is a really fascinating aspect of your book, Becoming Catawba, that we know women played vital roles in their community and that they were keeping Catawba culture alive and passing it on from one generation to the next, and that they're still doing that today. But in addition to all this work, Catawba women were also working to keep the Catawba people afloat financially as Europeans came in and imposed their market system and mercantilist ideas of economy on North American lands and communities. It's Catawba pottery that helps Catawba families buy the metal goods or the food or the cloth that they needed and wanted to survive.
Initially, it was both the men and the women contributing their labor to the household. And this still continued into the late 1700s, but you have to keep in mind by this time, the men had less access to hunting land because their land had been taken bit by bit by white settlers. So women, they're the family's caretaker. They feel pressured to help their children, their parents, their brothers, sisters, help them survive. And so pottery becomes one of the ways in which they can bring more trade goods into the home. And by trade goods, I mean corn, coffee, sugar, flour. The other way that women bring wages into the home is both they and the men are involved in a land leasing system that begins in 1785. And I look at this land leasing system, which has often been viewed as the decline of the nation. It's the march towards 100% dispossession. I look at it more as creating a paper trail of land ownership, because there are so many documents about these leases. There are land surveys, plats about these leases. But what was really interesting to me was that women owned and leased an equal amount of land that men did. And analyzing these land leases also shows that women continued to take care of the community. They're not only taking care of themselves, but they're taking care of orphan children in the village by collecting lease money or lease goods for these orphan children. So the leases, and what the leases show is there is a land plat book that still exists. And the payments, this is the rent payment book. The payments show how Catawbas are sharing these leased allotments of land. It remains in a specific family, but it's traded off from time to time in terms of collecting. So in that way, the land is still being thought of in a communal way. It's still being used in a communal way. The other important thing here is we often hear that Native people traded everything they had for liquor. In this specific rent book, one Indian, one Catawba, gets alcohol one time. Out of all the other exchanges throughout the book, this is the only one, which pushed back against that trope of the drunken Indian. I'm not trying to say that they didn't drink, because I know they did, but they're not exchanging their land for alcohol. And these leases were simply topsoil use agreements. It was never sales contracts. And that's another different way that Catawbas viewed the land.
Becoming Catawba is a sweeping history. It covers 300 years of history, and we actually now need to jump forward in time a bit. If you're interested in hearing more about how the Catawba fared during the American Revolution and the story of how they allied with the revolutionaries to fight against the British Empire, please go ahead and listen to episode 158. Brooke, we know that after the American War for Independence, states like New York, and New York was not the only state, but just as an example, these states began large campaigns to dispossess Native Americans from their homelands. Could you tell us how the Catawba fared in this push for indigenous dispossession? Did the fact that they had allied with the revolutionaries and may have still been allies with the new American government spare them from land dispossession? What was their life like after the revolution?
Thanks for this question. Catawba dispossession, it was delayed. It didn't happen immediately after the American Revolution. South Carolina came to the Catawbas in 1840 after white settlers had petitioned the state over and over again for rights to the land, because without total ownership of the land, they weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to serve in office in South Carolina. So the back country kind of went unrepresented up until around 1840. And because of these repetitive petitions, South Carolina ends up sending a commission to Catawba to negotiate a land cession treaty. It was finalized in 1840. It was ratified by the General Assembly in 1841. And also by that year, Catawbas are no longer on their land. Some have gone and joined with the Cherokee, but they wouldn't stay there long either because the Cherokee demanded that they totally assimilate to Cherokee way of life. And a large family group left Cherokee and went to the Choctaw in Oklahoma and became citizens of the Choctaw Nation around 1852. Other Catawbas at the time of the treaty, Nation 4 Treaty, they stayed in and around their ancestral land, but they were finally able to return to a small portion of that land in 1850 when money was used to purchase a little over 500 acres of land. And so gradually over time, Catawbas filtered back in. Part of this land is where the Catawba Reservation is still situated.
Brooke, we've talked a lot about the Catawba people in general, and I wonder if before we head into the time warp, if you could tell us a story of Sally New River. Sally was a Catawba woman who lived during the formative years of the United States, and I wonder if you could tell us about Sally's story and why you think it's important to center Indigenous women like Sally New River into our understanding of early American history.
Sally New River is a very unique character, and I've come to love her over the years that I've centered her in my work. So Sally was the granddaughter of Catawba Chief King Hagler. Around age 18 or 19, she had married General New River, who was also Catawba, and they lived in one of 3 Catawba villages. Sally is unique because of who she was related to, especially from an outsider perspective where English and American people looked at King Hagler and General New River as kind of like royalty and the patriarchs. So that's how she was known by the outsiders. But within Catawba, it sounds contradictory, but she was still seen as being like the rest of the women. But because of the role that she played in Catawba, as she got older, she was more respected, more relied on because she could read English. She could write English. So in 1796, she was deeded the remaining Catawba land of about 500 acres. This story right here is really what sent me on my journey on Catawba women. When I learned about her receiving this deed and that all the Catawba men, the main Catawba leaders, signed off on it, and it was filed in the courthouse records, flags went up for me. Like, how is this possible? What is happening here? And it would be stories like that about Sally that would encourage me to look more at not just Sally, but all Catawba women and what their responses were to settler colonialism. How did they respond? Because their lives were full of constant change. And I determined it was really important to tell these women's stories because just like the Catawba women of today, their lives are invisible. The outside world, outside communities don't see the hard work these women have put in. Many books have been written about Catawbas, but they focus primarily on the men's domain, politics, and warfare. And I just felt like it was important to tell this other side of the story rather than add to that invisibility. and because they're my people. You know, this is my heart, and I just wanted to tell their story.
And now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Brooke, in your opinion, what might have happened if Catawba women had not been willing to adapt to the geopolitical and economic changes Europeans wrought as they colonized North America? Do you think the Catawba Nation would have formed, and do you think the Catawba people would still exist today?
The short answer is no, I don't think we would have the Catawba Nation that we know today. It's not a matter of willingness. Again, the priority is survival. And this is the only way they knew how to respond. I do believe that if Catawba women had not responded in the many ways that they did, we would either have a different Catawba Nation, it may not even be called Catawba, or we would not have the nation. Just like it takes the men to defend and hunt for the people, it takes the women to do all the other caretaking. And they were and still are primarily the ones who passed down our traditional knowledge.
Brooke, now that your book, Becoming Catawba, is out, are you researching and writing something new? Are you working on a new project about the Catawba?
So I'm not focusing on specifically one Indigenous nation. I am working with Dr. Denise Bates, co-authoring a book, Southeastern Indigenous American Public History. It will look more at tribal initiatives that are aimed at hosting visitors, tourists, while also serving the internal community.
And how can we best reach you if we have questions about the rich histories of Catawba and Catawba women?
I can be reached at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. My email, you could find it in the history department under faculty, and contact me by email. That's the best way to get in touch with me.
Brooke Bauer, thank you for joining us again and for being so generous in introducing us to the Catawba people and the traditions of Catawba women.
Thank you so much for having me again. It's been a wonderful experience.
Catawba women ensured the creation of the Catawba Nation and its economic and cultural survival. While European diseases, indigenous warfare, and white settlers' encroachment on Catawba lands created a need for all Catawba-speaking peoples to band together, it was Catawba women who ensured that different and vital aspects of their family and village cultures survived and became elements of the new Catawba national culture. As Brooke told us, Europeans had set notions of how women and men should live and work together. Europeans viewed gender in binary terms. As such, they never fully appreciated or saw how the Catawba's fluid sense of gender made it possible for women, and really even required women, to serve as important economic contributors to their families and teachers and shapers of Catawba culture and politics. In the face of population loss and pressures on their land and resources, Catawba women made the coalescence of the Catawba-speaking peoples into one Catawba nation possible. Their selection of marriage partners with men who came from different villages softened the lines between Catawba-speaking families. Their ability to work with other women and create pottery, raise children, and cook for their communities allowed women to blur the lines between different Catawba-speaking cultures. Over time, the work and efforts of women made the birth of one Catawba people possible. So how did Indigenous people adapt to and survive the onslaught of Indigenous warfare, European diseases, and population loss between the 16th and 18th centuries? It was by coming together and allowing women to do the work of women. The work of making friends and families, the work of creating goods that could be used at home or sold abroad, and the work of passing on traditional cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. You'll find more information about Brooke, her book, Becoming Catawba, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/353. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Joseph Edelman, Holly White, and Ian Tonat. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other Indigenous cultures and peoples would you like to learn about next? Early America has a vast cultural history, so let me know about the directions you'd like to go. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.